which is titled Economic Resilience Amidst Turbulent Times. We actually wanted to discuss in this plenary, we plan to discuss the kind of challenges that have come up in the last 2 odd years regarding economic fragility, which is regarding debt restructuring, power sector reforms, trade imbalance, and other aspects of economics. And then, of course, what the government has currently tried to do in this regard. So today we will be joined by a very esteemed set of panelists, including Professor Dr. Shanatayan Devarajan. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. He is a professor of economics at Georgetown University, and he will be giving an agenda setting presentation as we go forward in the agenda. We are also joined by Dr. Najee bin Hassan, who is the country director in Pakistan for Pakistan World Bank Group. Dr. Samuel Risk, UNDP resident representative for Pakistan. Ms. Esther Perez Ruiz, IMF resident representative for Pakistan, and Dr. Dushni Veerakorn, who is the executive director, Institute of Policy Studies, Sri Lanka. With this, I'll hand over the stage to Dr. Abid Qayyum Suleri, who is the moderator for today. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ahad, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning, Dr. Devarajan. Thank you for joining us from Washington. This plenary, the last plenary of the day one, that is actually the essence and crux of our annual conference this year, which is the theme is from fragility to resilience. And the whole morning after inaugural plenary, in the second and third plenary, we were trying to understand some of the factors that can impart resilience to climate change, understanding not only the fragility to climate change, but also some of the factors that can impart resilience to it. And this very plenary that would be discussing the economic challenges facing a region, as well as some of the governance issues related to it. The way we have designed this plenary is that we'll be requesting Dr. Devarajan to give us a scene setting presentation, and that would be followed by some moderated question answers with my distinguished panelists, and we'll definitely try to have some room for question answers from the floor. Just to tell you that we were to be joined by some federal ministers, Federal Minister of Finance, or Federal Minister of Economic Affairs Division, but there is some important legislation and voting going on in the Parliament right now. So the political representatives, they couldn't join us, but we'll make sure that the recommendation that we get from this panel, we can float it to the relevant channels. So over to you, Dr. Devarajan, for your scene setting presentation.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here, to have a chance to speak with you, and also to see some of my good friends like Najee bin Hassan and Dushni Veerakorn on the screen. I wish I was there in person. Let me share my screen.
Yes, Dr. Devarajan, we can see your presentation on the screen.
You can see the presentation. Good. And I was first asked about 2 months ago or 3 months ago to speak about the experience of Sri Lanka, which I have been working on for the last 2.5 years, that might be relevant for the case of Pakistan. And I started thinking about it. And then, of course, as all of you know, things started unraveling in Bangladesh as well. And so I have decided to draw a comparison or take lessons from both the Sri Lankan experience and the Bangladesh experience for resilience, which is the theme of this conference. And I call it the cost of denial.
And this is I think, a very serious problem that we all suffer from. And I'd like to try to share it with you to see what you think of it.
So to get started, I mean, I think if you look at South Asia today, there's a bit of a puzzle. On the one hand, South Asian economies have been growing rapidly. They've been reducing poverty and improving human development since the 1990s. So you look at GDP per capita, for instance, of the South Asian countries, every single country has at least doubled its per capita income from 1990 to today. That's just in one generation. India and Sri Lanka have tripled their per capita incomes in that period. The other thing to keep in mind is that Sri Lanka grew at almost 5%, I mean, GDP per capita grew at almost 3% a year during a 26-year civil war. That period, at the first half of that line, covers the period of the Civil War. Now, this growth has actually led to rapid poverty reduction. Extreme poverty in the region is in single digits now. And again, this is despite civil wars, despite the fact that Bangladesh has at times been the most corrupt country in the world, and we had the civil war in Sri Lanka. And the human indicators, things like the enrollment ratios in secondary education, are rising very rapidly, are almost 100% in most of the South Asian countries. I should add that Pakistan is a little bit behind on that one. And the other really good news is that child mortality has fallen dramatically in all of these South Asian countries. And in some countries like Sri Lanka, child mortality rates are close to those of Europe. And they're, again, in the single digit range. Now, the reason I say this is a puzzle is that despite all of this good news, both Sri Lanka and Bangladesh experienced widespread protests, the resignation of the democratically elected leader, the president in the Sri Lankan case, the prime minister in the Bangladeshi case, and certainly in the Sri Lankan case, a sharp economic slowdown. In Bangladesh, it's too early to tell because the events are were just a few months ago, but there is a chance that too could go very badly. So you have this contrast between development successes over the last 30 years and a real collapse of the society with widespread protests and resentment from the population in the last 2 years. Now, what I'm going to try to convince you is that this is not a puzzle, that in fact, the development successes were what contributed to the crises. In particular, that they led to a sense of denial that the crisis was real, that the crisis was going on, and we enabled us to basically try to coast without taking the problems on directly, and that has led to certainly led to the collapse in Sri Lanka and might do something similar in Bangladesh. And let me just tell you the Sri Lankan case, because that's the one that we have at least 2.5 years of perspective on. Now, everyone points to the proximate causes of the Sri Lankan crisis, which go back to 2019, when the newly elected government of President Gotabaya Rajapaksa cut taxes. They cut taxes sharply so that the tax to revenue ratio went down to about 9%. I think it was the second lowest in the world at that point, second to Somalia or something. As you would expect, when they did that, when the tax to GDP ratio fell by so much, And the fiscal deficit widened, by the way, to about 13% of GDP. The credit rating agencies decided to downgrade Sri Lanka's credit rating down to near default levels. Now, this was in April 2020. Keep in mind that date is important because this was before the COVID pandemic had taken over all over the world. So by April 2020, Sri Lanka was already cut off from capital markets. They couldn't borrow. Now, what economists both inside and outside the country were advising the government at that point, and I've included in that list, I would say, was to do two things. One is to undertake a preemptive debt restructuring. At that point, Sri Lanka couldn't borrow, but they could actually restructure the debt. And the second was to move into an IMF program. Now, why were these the recommendations? Well, there's now some evidence from a recent paper that preemptive debt restructurings actually are milder than the post-default debt restructuring. So you don't wait till you run out of money and have to default to restructure the debt. This is evidence that they have the preemptive ones have smaller haircuts. They last much less time. They're much quicker. I mean, preemptive debt restructuring, the median is about a year to achieve it. The median for post-default debt restructuring is almost 5 years. And the most important thing is the economy recovers much more quickly with a preemptive debt restructuring. The dotted line shows how with the post-default debt restructuring, the economy contracts and continues to contract even after the debt restructuring, whereas with the preemptive one, the economy recovers almost instantly and doesn't last more than 1 or 2 years. The second is why should they have gone into an IMF program? And as you can imagine, there was a lot of criticism of the IMF and that they impose austerity and everything else. But the evidence is pretty clear now. I mean, there's the recent paper done by the Independent Evaluation Office of the IMF that looked at the impact of IMF adjustment programs relative to the counterfactual of similar countries that didn't do an IMF adjustment program. And it's clear that the ones with the IMF program had an additional growth of about over 0.5 percentage point of GDP, if not almost 0.8 percentage points. So the economic logic was clear. They had to go to a preemptive debt restructuring, and they had to go to an IMF program. And yet, and this is the problem, the government refused to do either. The Rajapaksa government, which was in power at that time, refused to do either. Instead, they continued to repay their creditors by drawing down reserves. And you keep in mind, they couldn't borrow, so the reserves just kept going down and down and down. They financed the fiscal deficit by borrowing from the central bank. Now, we know what that does. The textbooks can show us, and I will show you the two things that happened. One is reserves crashed to almost zero. By April 2022, which is 2 years after 2 years, the reserves had dwindled to nearly zero. And inflation hit 70%, just as the textbooks would predict. So we had a serious problem. The fact that reserves went down to zero meant that the country had no foreign exchange. There were shortages of fuel and food and medicines around the country, and they erupted in this widespread protest. And it's important that
the protest was focused exclusively on the administration, on Gotabaya.
The hashtag was "Go Home Gota." They put the blame on their horrible economic conditions squarely on the government. This is April 22, so they could have blamed the COVID pandemic. The Ukraine war had already started, and there were food prices and fuel prices were skyrocketing. No, the people blamed the government. They put the blame squarely on the government, and the net result was that President Rajapaksa had to flee the country and then later resigned, and a new government was installed. But I want to go back to why, when people were proposing a preemptive debt restructuring and an IMF program, why there was so much resistance by the government, why the government just refused to do it, right? Why they said no. And it goes back to, there are a couple of reasons. One is people said, well, Sri Lanka has never restructured its debt. We've never done this before. We can't do it now, which obviously was wrong because they did do it, but they had to do it and they were forced to do it. The second was, this is what people tell me now, I didn't make this up, is that they were concerned both for the political fallout of an IMF program, sometimes those measures are unpopular, and they were concerned that the IMF may look into the corruption in government, that this exposes them to a lot more scrutiny about corruption. Then the other thing is that the history of Sri Lanka, if you look at Sri Lankan economic history, you find that Sri Lanka had survived other crises by good luck. For instance, in the 1970s, when the youth bulge was coming on stream to the labor market, and there were no jobs because of the legacy of a socialist government, the Middle East opened up. And all of the Sri Lankan workers found jobs in the Gulf. In the 1980s, they had a balance of payments crisis. In the mid-1980s, they had a balance of payments crisis, but just then there was a drought in Kenya and tea prices shot up. And so that solved the balance of payments crisis. And the same thing, tragically, in 2004, they were heading towards a balance of payments crisis. And there was the Indian Ocean tsunami, which is tragic because lots of people died and lots of houses were destroyed, and including some friends of mine were killed. At the same time, the emergency assistance got Sri Lanka out of what would have been a balance of payments crisis. And this led one vice president at the World Bank, who had seen this happen several times, to say, I'm convinced God is a Sri Lankan. Now, there are more fundamental issues, I would say, which go back to what I was talking about earlier, which is Sri Lanka is one of the most successful economies in Asia, not just South Asia. And there was a feeling in the country that the factors that made it such a successful economy will be the same factors that will rescue it from the current crisis. This is the denial I'm talking about. Sometimes, in fact, I at that time used the example of Bangladesh with the Sri Lankan policymakers to say, the Bangladesh actually did a preemptive program with the IMF, I think in 2023. And I said, look, you might want to take a lesson from what Bangladesh is doing. And their response was, oh, don't talk to us about Bangladesh. We have much better human development indicators than Bangladesh, so we're better than they are. And that's the kind of denial that you've been so successful in certain domains that you don't think you could actually go wrong in this crisis, and yet they did. And here's where the cost of denial comes in, because in 2022, the Sri Lankan economy crashed and collapsed.
the growth rate was negative 7.5% that year. The following year was an additional negative 2.3%. So it's an almost 10% decline over a two-year period. And it's slowly coming back, but it's been a huge amount of hardship. Poverty rates have doubled, undernutrition rates have gone up. The country is still suffering, and particularly the poor. And if you look at it from a historical point of view, Sri Lanka's per capita GDP today is back to where it was in 2014. So it's what we, in the context of Latin America, we used to call the lost decade, where Sri Lanka has gone through a lost decade. It hasn't grown past what it was 10 years ago. Okay. Now, let me turn to Bangladesh, because it's a different situation in Bangladesh. In Bangladesh has been consistently a strong performer, particularly on growth. The growth rate has accelerated by 1 percentage point every decade. And in particular, it's been held out as, unlike many other South Asian countries, it's been held out as a manufacturing exporter, the garment exports. Poverty reduction has been rapid, and its health and education indicators are better than those in neighboring India, even though India started out at a better level. So this is clearly a success story on development, has been called that. Now, at the same time, Bangladesh has had consistently high levels of corruption and weak governance. If you look at the Corruption Perception Index from Transparency International, you see that Bangladesh is way below India and Sri Lanka, and obviously way below that of Denmark, but it's down near the bottom. And at one year back in the early 2000s, it was actually the most corrupt country in the world. Other indicators are the same. In the worldwide governance indicators, they're in the bottom quartile of the world on almost all the dimensions of good governance. And the Global Competitiveness Index puts Bangladesh way lower than Sri Lanka and India, although a little bit better than Pakistan, I might add, and that's something we can discuss later. But the point is that because Bangladesh was doing so well on these other dimensions like growth and poverty reduction, things we care about, the international community and the Bangladeshi government basically didn't address the corruption and the governance. They continued to praise Bangladesh for its development results, and kept the rest of it on a low burner. Let me give you a couple of examples. So there was a certain official at the World Bank who said, in Bangladesh, there was development despite the corruption because people found ways of going around the government. The other side of this is that the government made space for the NGOs and private sector to function. So this person was essentially excusing the government for the corruption by saying, look at the results. Now, I have to say that person was me when I was chief economist of the South Asia region in the early 2000s. But that hasn't changed. If you look at the World Bank's website on Bangladesh, they say the banner headline is, Bangladesh has an inspiring story of growth and development, aspiring to become an upper middle income country by 2031. And since 1972, they very proudly say the World Bank has committed more than $39.5 billion to support Bangladesh's development journey. Now, the point is, this country
it was considered ready to go on, become an upper middle income country. And in fact, in April of this year, the World Bank organized a conference in Washington, and the title of the conference was Bangladesh's route to becoming a upper middle income country. Now, they made the mistake of inviting me to be the keynote speaker, and so I decided, because I had been out of touch recently about what's going on in Bangladesh, I started reading up what was going on, and I began to see that things were not looking good. So I gave a talk. My talk at that conference was Bangladesh is in danger of becoming a fragile state. This was April 24. And I just looked at some statistics. I looked at the Fragile States Index. In the Fragile States Index, Bangladesh is sandwiched between Iran and Equatorial Guinea. In the Rule of Law Index, again, it's between Iran and Mozambique, near the bottom. And on World Press Freedom Index, it's right next to Saudi Arabia. This is not good. And this to me is a real danger sign, especially if you are thinking you're going to go to become a middle income country. And sure enough, as you probably know, this was in April 24. By July of 24, there was a protest, student protest, that started out on protesting the quotas for descendants of the liberation fighters for government jobs. But when the government responded with violence, the protest grew, and they brought in everybody, the garment workers, the rickshawallas, the storekeepers, the university students, and professors. And eventually, and you saw that picture, I mean, it was pretty much everybody was out there on the street. The prime minister was forced to resign. Now, when I look at the Bangladesh case, I see again this fact that the development successes of Bangladesh enable the government and the international community to overlook bad governance. Like I remember having conversations with the government back when I was the chief economist, and saying, then the government would say, you know, I thought you guys were about results. Here are the results. Just look at the results. Stop harassing us about the corruption. But the thing we missed, well, one of the things we missed, was that this decades of corruption and misgovernance led to a breakdown of trust between citizens and the government. So the government could tell a good story about results, and the story was real. But what was going on inside people's heads was that this government is basically not working for us. The other thing that we missed, and this is, I see my friend Naji Benazine is there, but I think this is something that the bank needs to take quite seriously, which is that we celebrate the reduction in extreme poverty. And in Bangladesh's case, that was true. There was huge success in reducing extreme poverty. But when people leave the $2.15 a day poverty level, they enter the middle class. So they enter $3 a day and sometimes $5 a day, living on $5 a day. And the middle class, and here's the data for Bangladesh. You can see that the dark orange is the extreme poverty, and that has been falling. But the yellow, the people living between 365 and 365 and 685 a day, that's actually been growing. Not surprising, because these people who left extreme poverty are entering those levels. But the point is that those people have different preferences. First of all, you have more university graduates, again, thanks to the success. But they desire white-collar jobs. They don't want to work in the garment factories. And they demand things like rights, freedom, justice, and voice. So their preferences are much more they demand much more things, which is precisely the things that the government was suppressing or refusing to deliver on. So you really created thanks to the success, you really created this group of people who weren't going to tolerate the bad governance anymore. And they went out on the streets and they managed to get rid of Sheikh Hasina. And there's an interim government now. And in fact, the interim government has some students in the cabinet. And so the new dispensation, whatever comes out, is going to be very different. But so far, this has also had this denial has had an effect, which is that Bangladesh's growth just for this fiscal year, the growth rate, the World Bank has downgraded its growth between April of this year and September of this year. It has downgraded its growth forecast for the year by 1.7 percentage points. That's huge. That's almost 40% of the growth rate. That's just for this 1 year. I don't know how much longer it's going to be slowing down, but whatever it is, these events, which are quite disruptive, have had an effect on at least the World Bank's estimate of growth, if not actually having an effect on growth, and it may continue. So let me conclude by saying that I take away from these two episodes that the cost of denial is real. It's huge. When we deny something that's going wrong in a country because there are so many things going right, we take a huge risk. And the risk, it might seem like, well, it creates volatility. It means that growth is going to be volatile if you take these risks. And we know that there's a very strong negative correlation between volatility and growth. This is just one example of that. But I think there's a deeper problem here. And there's some new research or recent research that looks at that, which is denial leads to the increased possibility of economic downturns, while people are celebrating the economic upturns. And the point is that an economic downturn is more damaging than an economic upturn is helpful. Let me just end by illustrating that with this graph, which is a bit, you have to stare at it for a few minutes before you get it. This is a graph that looks at countries at different levels of per capita income. So the extreme right are countries with per capita income over $20,000. And the extreme left is countries with per capita income less than $2,000. Right? And what you find, obviously the countries that have per capita income of $20,000 are the ones that have grown faster than the ones that are still at $2,000. And, countries all have growth upturns and growth downturns, or shrinking and growing years, as they call it here. And the one thing you notice is that the rate of growth during the growing years, which is the orange dot you see there, that doesn't vary that much across these countries. That the rate of growth during your growing years, the rate at which you grow, doesn't seem to be that different. And yet, these countries had very different levels of per capita income. So the difference is that beige colored portion, which is the number of years that you spend shrinking. The blue part is the number of years you spend shrinking. Now, and you see that there's a big difference between the poor countries. The poor countries spend many more years shrinking than the rich countries. So another way to put it is that the rich countries, the reason they became rich is that they avoided years of shrinking. Now, with denial, we increase the possibility that we'll have years of shrinking, as we're seeing in Sri Lanka and maybe in Bangladesh. So the real cost of denial is not just what's going on today, but the fact that we risk having more years of shrinking which will be in the long run detrimental to the country's growth. We are shortchanging our children and our grandchildren with our denial of the current serious situation. And I really want to urge the international community, and I see some representatives of it on the among the discussants, to really rethink the way we portray our the situation in our countries. We're always tempted to talk in terms of what the country's doing well and downplay what it's doing badly, but we run a huge risk that those things it's doing badly will come back and haunt us for a long time. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Devarajan, for setting the scene. I really liked the punchline of your last slide. Long-term growth is less about how fast one grows than about not tripping along the way. We have seen our moments of cost of denial in Pakistan too. I think because there is no representative from Pakistan sitting on the podium, so I think I will have to just give a few comments on their behalf. So whenever we try to control our exchange rate artificially, whenever we tried not to go to IMF in a preemptive manner, whenever we relied on one tranche arrangement with IMF and thought that this tranche can give us breathing space and the program got suspended, we had our moments of cost of denial. And in fact, there is a lot to be learned from both Bangladesh and Sri Lanka in case of Pakistan. I'll quickly go to Dushni to get her additional comments about the presentation Sri Lanka and the Bangladesh, but I really don't want to discuss what went wrong. As you can see, the theme of the conference this year is from fragility to resilience. So I really want to understand from you that what is it that is now going right after Sri Lanka declared default that has given Sri Lanka some perceived or visible stability, and whether that stability is sustainable after the next government has taken over, which of course have some populist claims to make. Please feel free to take whatever part of the question you want to take. Dushni, over to you.
Good evening. Okay.
Thank you, Abid. And let me also thank Shanta for a very interesting scene setting. I'll just take your question in two parts. One is to comment on what Shanta said. I mean, I agree with some of what he said on the Sri Lankan sort of, denial, but not fully. And that's because as someone who has been in Colombo and working with governments over the decades, we miss the political economy issues. Because if you look at the reasons why we didn't go to the IMF, it is the same political leadership, the same economic advisors that did go to the IMF in 2009 and implemented a program to the end in 2012. So what was the difference in 2019 that they refused to entertain it? First was the debt restructuring, and second is, the geopolitics and the political economy risks of the IMF route. And that's something that we need to understand, why governments are reluctant. In 2019, the Sri Lankan economy, not quite what Shanta said, that it was a development success. 2019, we were coming through a IMF program, 2016 to 2019. Growth had slowed considerably to 1% or less. And that is the reason why the incoming president decided, okay, taxes had been raised for fiscal consolidation, hugely unpopular. The government was voted out. Incoming president wanted to boost economic output and reduced taxes. Now, COVID came along. The policy misstep was not in recognizing that we need to do something unilaterally if there was a reluctance to go to the IMF.
the reluctance to approach the IMF had to do with the debt situation. In December 2019,
IMF staff report said Sri Lanka's debt is unsustainable. Once that statement is made, you can't entertain preemptive debt restructuring without the IMF involvement. And the financing landscape, we have bilateral creditors who are not very keen on engaging with the IMF on debt restructuring. And that was one key reason why there was reluctance. Second was, of course, government's own ideological point of view. What have we, and just to underscore, in 2022 onwards, the political leadership did the right things, followed the IMF prescription, but voted out. So there is always the political risks associated with implementing an IMF program that makes governments very reluctant to engage with the stringent conditions about raising taxes, doing away with subsidies, wage freeze on the public sector, all within a very limited 3-year period, which generates its own backlash. And I think we need to understand that. Coming out of the crisis, and the second part of your question, I think Sri Lanka has, we've done better than expected. And that again, I would say largely because the government realized this is not business as usual. Previous crises, Sri Lanka didn't have this foreign debt. And we didn't have to deal with international creditors. This time, the ground situation is different. If we don't have foreign reserves to repay debt, no one is going to lend to us. So commitment to implement all of the IMF targets and programs. And again, surprisingly, including World Bank, IMF, growth projection for Sri Lanka was 2%. IMF put it at 2.1, World Bank 2, but they see the recovery, we're doubling. Where recovery this year is expected to be in excess of 4%. And the World Bank then, came along 2 weeks ago and revised their growth forecast to 4.2%. Now, even if you talk to the IMF, that a country that's gone through a recession can recover faster, they look at their data set and they say, no, that's not possible. So their baseline medium-term growth forecast for Sri Lanka is still 2.1% and going to 3% over the next 3 years. But the ground resilience, since that you use that term, is that the recovery has been much better than what was expected. So I think if the political commitment and will is there to implement some of these reforms, not at the behest of the IMF or the World Bank, but because our political leaders recognize that we need to do it and convey that message to the population in a way that brings people on board, we can manage our economies much better. I mean, I would not take Sri Lanka as a development success that Shanta very generously called us, because if you look at why we had that high growth, that was because it was debt-driven growth. We borrowed to invest in infrastructure. And obviously that pushed up our growth rate, but doesn't mean that that growth was sustainable. But again, encouraging signs from where we are now emerging out of the initial stages of the crisis.
Thank you, Dushni. Najay, if I can come to you, you heard the presentation. Again, as I said, that I can see a lot of similarities. Rather, if Dr. Devarajan had omitted the names of the countries, it could have been a very similar story in most of South Asian countries, except India, which has its own growth trajectory. But way forward from your point of view, do you think that now some of the measures and steps that government has been taking since the last standby arrangement we are now coming out of that denial, and we are trying to do something better than what we have been doing in the past?
Thank you. That was super interesting, and I've been in Pakistan for more than 4 years now. So after a while, you tend to come to the view that the country you work on is really different, and you're focusing on differences. So I may overdo this and confront my friend and mentor Chantal on some of the points, because I think I mean, first of all, in terms of the assessment of the development trajectory and the successes, I would claim, and we say this in our various reports. If you look at the human capital indicators, if you look at education attainment, health attainments, even the average growth rate, let alone per capita income, given the high fertility rate in Pakistan, no, we cannot say that a reason of denial of structural issues is big successes in Pakistan's development trajectory. It is not. And in fact, in some of the graphs that Dr. Chanda showed, you can see Pakistan as an outlier there, including on human capital. And the other difference, but I'll come back to the denial story, which is important because it is there, but in a different form, is that there's no hesitation to go into regular adjustment programs with the IMF in Pakistan. We're at the 24th, I think, 25th, 21. Okay. Okay, good correction, because we kept citing 23, but 21 programs, and the structural issue and the tax to GDP ratio since the late 90s is the same at 10-11% with little variation. So it's not a country where when crisis hits or there's a downturn, you have long periods of denial that there needs to be an adjustment, because we had, and that's the problem, the growth and macro program of Pakistan is the series of boom and bust cycles that keep coming back. But then the realization that there needs to be short-term adjustment comes pretty quickly. So there's no denial that last summer or even 4 years ago, because these cycles are shorter and shorter, there was no denial of the crisis in Pakistan by the authorities, nor there is now, of course. Yet, I think the issue is with almost like short memory, because the speed at which over the years, over the decades, Pakistan goes back to its status quo of trying to boost growth in an unsustainable manner by boosting consumption through unsustainable government spending and instead of productivity growth. The story keeps repeating itself cycle after cycle, and even with short term. So I think the puzzle for me in Pakistan is less the denial of the core of the problems on the sources of these boom and bust cycles, but how much these moments of reforms are short-lived, and how much the previous crisis and the sources of it is almost forgotten. So you ask me whether now the government is on the right track. I have no hesitation to say yes. Absolutely no hesitation, be it on the fiscal reforms, the SOE reforms, the energy sector reforms, fiscal topics in the provinces, which is relatively new. No hesitation to say it's on the right track. If you had asked me, do you think this is the moment? Is this going to be different from the previous decades of short-lived reforms? This I can't answer. But if I use the track record of the past 2 decades at least, Yes, that's the big question mark. That's the big question mark, whether this time is the moment, and these reforms on which there's no denial today, whether they will stick this time is the question mark. I'd like to end with one point. The difficulty, and maybe that could be called denial, is that these cycles of costly unnecessary short-term adjustments consume so much political capital, because these are difficult, that important topics, important what we call silent crises, are always put on the back burner. You know, when the level of stunting being at 40% in Pakistan and stable over the past 2 to 3 decades, and the level of learning poverty, and the little that's invested in the social sectors, for example, rarely makes the headlines. While the important things, of course, like the level of the reserves, the level of the rupee, the level of inflation, make the headlines every day. And I think that's the denial or forgetting of those fundamental issues is very costly, because short-term crisis kind of put all of these fundamental things on the back burner for too long. Sorry, I was long, but the question was tough one.
It was really important. Now, Esther, I come to you. My actual question to you, taking up from where Najee left, is that how does IMF program, the current IMF program, is helping Pakistan to become a stronger and more inclusive economy. But before it, there is 2 secondary questions. And the first is, we saw in Dr. Devarajan's presentation that in Sri Lanka's case, the growth that was achieved in IMF program, even when the program was completed, it was short-lived growth. So whether it was just that the governments in Sri Lanka, they reversed what did they
do right in the IMF program, or it was just the impact of the medicine that was not long-lasting. And the second thing that Dushni raised, the political economy of it. We know that tomorrow, our tomorrow, and today when Americans, they would vote, one of the important factors would be about the taxation, corporate tax, whether it gets increased, or do we get some sort of, they get tax rebate, and that would be the choice between Republicans and Democrats, one of the reasons that a voter would be choosing. So how to actually make sure that the cost of transition from fragility to stability is not only borne by lower and lower middle income earners when a country is in an IMF program? And I'm asking it generally, not only in Pakistan context.
Thank you very much. Good evening to everyone, and it's really my pleasure to be here representing the fund, and I'm very honored to share this panel with the Executive Director for the Institute of Policy Studies in Sri Lanka, the World Bank's Country Director, and the UNDP Resident Representative. Let me begin as IMF Resident Representative in Pakistan, highlighting that over the past year, we've witnessed a remarkable return to macroeconomic stability in Pakistan. We have seen growth has resumed. Inflation has declined dramatically with very visible gains for all of Pakistanis, but most importantly, for the most vulnerable, which are disproportionately hit by high inflation. Pakistan has recorded its first primary surplus in 20 years, and foreign reserves have more than doubled, placing Pakistan in a more comfortable position to honor its external liabilities, and so keeping debt sustainable, which is the stated goal of the authorities. And what these improvements show is that there is growing confidence in Pakistan's policy direction, which has been more consistent, and consistency is critical, more consistency since the launch of the 2023 standby arrangement. And I think this serves as a testament to the ownership and the dedication of the Pakistani governments, but also to the resilience of the Pakistani people in upholding the sound macroeconomic policies. And the good policies, as we've seen since mid-2023, can deliver and can deliver relatively quickly. It is a remarkable turnaround. Following this return to stability, the path forward, as we see it in our partnership with the authorities, is to transition from the renewed stability to a stronger, more resilient growth, and growth that can benefit more and more segments of the population and really being shared broadly across the society. And this requires commitment to maintaining the sound macroeconomic policies, but also to break away in picking up from Naji's point, which is, of course, emphasized in our recently published staff report upon the approval of the current extended fund facility for Pakistan, breaking away from previous boom-bust cycles and shifting towards a growth and a development model that promotes a more efficient public sector and that fosters healthy market competition. So this is the vision that is underpinned in the homegrown program, the 2024 program, which is the 21st IMS program with Pakistan, the Extended Fund Facility, which supports, as I said, a roadmap for sustained and inclusive growth through several key pillars, and let me outline these key pillars. First, protecting real incomes through a monetary policy that is dedicated to controlling inflation, through the continued expansion of the social protection schemes, and through accelerated reforms in the energy sector that enhance the viability of the energy sector, but also the affordability of the energy tariffs. And enhancing the affordability of tariffs through cost-side reforms in the energy sector is one of the key emphasis or the key focuses of the current program vis-a-vis previous programs' engagements. Secondly, improving tax fairness by previously under-taxed sectors, having them now contributing to the national effort of mobilizing domestic revenues, as this approach can, coming back to Dr. Suleri's point, can potentially ease the tax burden of those who are already contributing to domestic revenues. And in this context, the provinces will play a very important role because they are expected to mobilize the tax bases that lie within their jurisdictions, supported by enhanced enforcement, enhanced digitalization efforts, aim at curbing evasion, tax evasion, and aim at increasing compliance of broader segments of the population. The third pillar is, and we have discussed development from several angles, but really to invest in the people. Investing in people is vital for social inclusion, for social progress. And increased government revenue, and we need to remember Pakistan features one of the lowest tax to GDP ratios worldwide, will enable Pakistan to advance its development priorities, including continuing the expansion of social protection and expanding healthcare, education, critical infrastructure. And again, in this context, the role of provinces, as outlined in the 18th constitutional amendment, will be central in delivering public goods to the local communities, and will be enabled by a national fiscal pact between the federal government and the provinces. And the fourth pillar, which is one of the key emphases of the current program, is building on the stability that has been restored to create a market-oriented economy through a comprehensive growth agenda aimed at generating jobs, and which should remove the concessions, the policy concessions that have in the past trapped resources in low productivity sectors, that should lower the energy cost, as I mentioned, through structural reforms in the energy sector, making the exporters more competitive globally. One growth agenda that aims to enhance the public sector and public service delivery through the reform of the state-owned enterprises, and to reduce the trade distortions to address import substitution and to encourage exports. And this is the vision that is endorsed in the 2024 Extended Fund Facility. And we are of the view that if the government endorses and consistently adheres to these sound policies and reforms that favor market competition, Pakistan can leverage its labor force potential and can expand its middle class and achieve a future marked by economic strength and broad-based prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you, Esther, and that brings me to Sam. Sam, you heard the four excellent interventions, and whatever they are advocating, it directly impacts achievement of sustainable development goals, whether a country can improve its SDGs while trying to do the debt restructuring, whether a country can improve its SDGs while in an IMF program, whether there can be some other prescription and recipes of improving it, and also you have to navigate the whole political economy of it. So from your perspective, what is your take on what has been said so far?
Thanks. Thanks very much. Once you get to the end of the panel, then there's not so much to add other than general and anecdotal reflections. So I'll start there. One is, I'll speak a little bit about Pakistan, but also a little bit about global issues that I think are also important here, because Pakistan is not an outlier in some of these. One is where Pakistan features on many indicators. So Human Development Index, Pakistan dipped from 161 to 164. There are other countries like Haiti that are surprisingly doing better, which is kind of surprise. Gender index gap at the very bottom. Rule of law index that just came out, 129 out of 132. The only positive news is that this is an improvement. Last year, I think, was 130. And I think on many of these indicators, you look and you see Pakistan dipping. And I think this is point number one. Why is it that there appears to be a bit of a sharp contrast between what realistically is a success story from bankruptcy or near bankruptcy in June 2023 to August and September 2024 for Pakistan? And I contrast here with a short anecdote about a video I just saw last week finance minister was at the IMF meetings 2 weeks ago, was interviewed by Jihad Azhour, one of the managing directors. Finance minister, this is an interview of 28 minutes. 26 minutes worth of exactly what we heard, the positive trajectory, the political will for reform. And then the interviewer asked the finance minister of Pakistan one last question. So all of this is going in the right direction. What worries you for the future? And he said basically that Pakistan has 3 existential risks. Existential is his word, not mine. Population, climate change, and stunting. So everything can actually go in the right direction. But if nothing is done on some of these mega issues, then I think there remains a challenge. How is it that you can have positive indicators and macroeconomic stability, and you still feel that there is social, political anxiety, there's economic anxiety? And this is where I look at the headlines from the past few human development reports and just listen to the titles of these reports, not even the content. Uncertain times, unsettled lives 2 years ago. Breaking the gridlock this past year. Beyond income, beyond averages, and beyond today. And I think this brings us to the point that Naji mentioned earlier, which is the short-termism that exists, whether it's optimism or anything else. We can get to a milestone, we get things done, but what happens for the next 4 or 5 years, that's kind of the challenge. The discussions that we are having now are where can we be on Pakistan reaching any reasonable achievement on sets of indicators and targets for the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, when last year Pakistan was only on track to meet 35 out of 169 goals. The financing gap alone is staggering at this point. Pakistan itself needs about $52 billion between now and 2030 to cover the SDGs. You know, the cost of inaction was an important title for an FCDO-supported research recently on the climate finance gap. Anywhere between 1.5 to $4 trillion is the gap for Pakistan, just to actually get to some kind of reasonable resilience from a climate finance perspective, just on climate change. So all this to say, point number 1, there is a clear discrepancy or a gap or a mismatch that we often see between macroeconomic stability. All of the numbers are going in the right direction, incredible success story, and where we are on almost everything else. And I think the difference is as described: short-termism, short-term memory. Let's just get over this hurdle and then go back to business as usual, plus everything else. Secondly, a multidimensional crisis, if we actually believe that, then requires multidimensional problems. This is the point that Abid and also the colleague from the Sri Lanka also mentioned, which is a country that has an economic problem, a climate change problem, a neighborhood problem, a security problem, a political transition problem in just 1 year, then requires multidimensional solutions. All of these issues around the economy are super critical, but everything governance related is just as critical. Whether it's on corruption and transparency, whether it's on rule of law. And I think if you've been watching the political mood in the country around the skirmishes between the bureaucracy and the judiciary and parties and parliament, and you're still looking for a bankable country for bankable projects, or who are you going to invite to invest, then I think more of that raises cause for concern rather than cause for stability. Multidimensional solutions to multidimensional problems are critical. Resilience of who or of what? New NDP, many other development partners, they are concerned with the resilience of people and communities and institutions. A single incident in 2022, $30 billion worth of loss and damage occurred. Pakistan needs to decide what kind of resilience in the face of the next tragedy or concern or crisis it will have. it would not be uncommon that something else will happen in the future, and not to be sort of the bearer of bad news, but 2023 and 2024 appear to be lucky that there was not any particular strong either drought or flood, apart from several Gulf incidents in the north. But which country, let alone Pakistan, can withstand the next flood or cost of living crisis or something else? Where is the money going to come from? And I think this is one contribution that we can share, because it's not only about us, it's basically about everyone that's here. Funding, financing, investment, and insurance. Pakistan complains quite a bit around not having enough grant money. And that is true, but there are a number of reasons for that. Grant money is elsewhere. It's going to go to Lebanon and Gaza. It's going to Ukraine, financing other crises. And that grant money, unfortunately, appears as humanitarian money. Who wishes for the next crisis in order to get grant money, free money? Now, Pakistan has been in this position where, in response to the 2022 floods, the money that came in was partially grant money, but very little. $500 million were pledged in Geneva, whereas the rest was actually loans or rolled over loans or other. So that is an issue. Financing. In UNDP, a lot of people and the UN system and the Secretary General, and as part of the Summit of the Future, debt sustainability was raised as a critical issue. There is a place for debt. There is a question of debt sustainability. And that, I think, for a country like Pakistan, is important to figure out where are the limits. For the past year and a half, it seemed that part of the resonant argument was, and this is just the anecdotal part, go borrow in order to borrow more, or secure debt in order to get some debt. There is a question mark, I think, to be had around there about the sustainability of here. Secondly, the responsibility of the government. And this is what puts me into one of the eyes, the investment part. How are you going to invite investors, even if they are domestic, if the government itself is crowding out investors from being able to get loans from commercial banks? That is a responsibility here that needs to be discussed. And the last part, if we are really concerned about the resilience of the most vulnerable individuals in the face of the next inevitable climate shock or crisis, then somebody has to be discussing the issue of insurance for the most poor. Who is going to pay the premium? Where is that going to come from? Insurance of people, crops, homes, etc. Because without disposable income in the pockets of people who do not have money to spend on education or health, or enough to put food on the table, nobody is going to shell out any money to pay for insurance, which for a lot of people is disposable income, which in a country like Pakistan, which has a 1% penetration of insurance among the population, who is actually going to do that? So the resilience of people and communities and institutions is quite critical. I close with just a global perspective on the multidimensional poverty index that just came out. 112 countries surveyed. Some of them have poor data. Largely, you're looking at data from about 100 countries. 1.1 billion people in the country at this point, the majority of which are young, the majority of which are rural, the majority of which are in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia. Here and India, a big part of what that means. And the numbers aren't actually going in the right direction. I think it is important to figure out how, for Pakistan's sake, but also in the global sphere, how we can actually move from multidimensional poverty to multidimensional solutions to get out of these proposals. Where is the sign of hope? If inclusion means digital, because you can't access everyone, hard to reach areas, getting more women in, including as part of the National Human Development Report that we got, then I think that is a way to do it. If investing in human resources, which is part of the plan, and I think that is critical and hopeful, And I think the last part definitely has to be in the private sector, who, despite all of the challenges that exist, the private sector is discussing sustainable development goals now in a way that is no longer about corporate social responsibility, that is no longer about charity. It's about some commitment and an enlightened sense of doing business that enables them, I think, to do two things at the same time: to do good and to do well at the same time. Thanks again.
Thank you. I know we are going a bit short of time, but I really want to come to all the panelists for very short interventions. Dr. Devarajan, if I can come to you, and being a devil's advocate, I can see we in Pakistan always envied the social indicators in Sri Lanka, and we were looking at Bangladesh's economic progress and economic growth. And then we found out that neither very impressive social indicators nor very impressive economic growth could save the governments of the time, both in Sri Lanka and in Bangladesh. You have been conducting and doing research on the whole region. So do you think that God is with Pakistan and doing some special favor to us? When I look at all the social indicators, I find myself, even in the fragility index and all other indexes you were doing, except for freedom of press, we were much below Bangladesh. And in our social and human development index, we are much below Sri Lanka. And again, in terms of economic growth. So what do you foresee the future for Pakistan if we have to choose a path for resilience? What is it that we need to do right?
Okay, well, thank you very much. And thanks to the participants for a very interesting discussion. I've learned so much. So I just want to make 2 points because we don't have much time. The first is from, Naji, I think that he didn't think my denial approach applied to Pakistan. But I have to say that everything I've heard today reinforces my feeling that there is some denial going on in Pakistan. And let me tell you why. When I listen to the lady from the IMF, Esther, about the challenges that Pakistan is facing that they need to address, like taxing the untaxed sector, rationalizing the energy sector. And when I listen to Sam talk about the human development deficiencies in the country, what amazes me is these were exactly the same problems we were raising 25 years ago. When I was chief economist for South Asia, I did a whole bunch of these development policy operations and so on. And the problems were the same, the conditions were the same. So something is not working if 25 years later, we're doing the same, we're still trying to fix those problems. That meant that there was some denial that we thought these problems would go away if we did something, and they didn't go away, and we continued doing whatever we were doing. And I'm really worried when Abid, I think, was saying that or no, maybe Najib, that you have these fluctuations. Because as I was trying to point out at the end, fluctuations are not only difficult for any country, but the downsides, the downturns are really costly in the long run. So I think we really have to think, look at ourselves in the mirror and say, have we been denying? Have we been in denial? I have seen cases where people have, shall we say, disbursed a policy operation, even if some of the conditions were not met, saying, oh, well, it'll fix it the next time. And that's what I call the denial, right? Rather than addressing the real problem in the country. And I fully agree with Sam. The real problem is the human development failures. we have to do something about that. And we've been saying that for 25 years. So I want to see a much greater focus on these aspects. Now that brings me to the second point, which I think Dushni raised, but then Naji also mentioned it, which is geopolitics, which is clearly an important factor here. But my concern is that the geopolitics also plays into this denial. I saw that in Sri Lanka. In fact, Dushni mentioned it in Sri Lanka. During the time when Sri Lanka was cut off from private capital markets, one of the reasons they didn't go for a debt restructuring or an IMF program was that they thought some bilateral creditors like China would bail them out. Because it's no secret that China is in a Cold War with the United States, and then there's China and India in rivalry. So Sri Lanka is in this situation where it thought that it was going to benefit from all of this geopolitics and get bailed out. The truth is, they didn't get a penny from the Chinese. That's not what the Chinese did. And the end result was that Sri Lanka had to default. So, and I dare say, back in the early 2000s, I don't think I'm telling stories out of school. It was a similar situation in Pakistan, where right after 9/11, and they were hunting for Osama bin Laden and everything else, there was geopolitical pressure to support Pakistan, even if the economic reforms had not been done. So I think this geopolitics continues to contribute to the denial that we all seem to be suffering from. And in fact, I think that such geopolitics that benefited Pakistan in the past is no longer benefiting Pakistan. So we have to be even more careful not to use the legacy of that.
Thank you, Najee. I think you want to respond?
Yes, I think that's a very valid point, and I have to agree with Shanta on this one. What I meant that there was no denial. There's no denial in Pakistan in identifying the core structural issues, at least on the macro fiscal front, that need to be addressed. But where there may be a denial is the point you mentioned, and I'm taking a long-term perspective here, that Pakistan may have suffered from donors or partners support curse. As you know, some countries suffer from Dutch disease and resource curse that blocks, that lessens the incentives to reform. This thinking that there'll eventually be a bailout, and the track record over the past decades has been this way, has probably reinforced this tendency of starting reforms and then the train stops and we're back to the original equilibrium of fueling growth in an unsustainable until the next crisis comes and new bailout comes. That I think. And what I think, but this is all speculative, is that this long period of resource curse of support, which in some way could have been detrimental to sustain reforms, may be ending. In my view, the risk of denial is not realizing that maybe the world has changed and maybe this past equilibrium will not continue so strongly and so predictably for a long time. That, I think, is a big risk. I think I see the risk of denial more in the coming years, of thinking that we are back to this type of, no matter what happens, there'll be support around. So on this, I'm with you, Shanta.
Thank you, Najee. Dushni, a very brief comment. Do you think that there's still some hope for regional cooperation for the countries in the region to actually learn from each other, and the thesis that your and mine common mentor Saman Kalagama had about this enhanced trade and connectivity and linkages, and is it still valid, or has it vanished somewhere in this whole geopolitical changes that we observed over last decade?
I think in terms of lessons, I mean, if I just take visitors and emails and phone calls and requests to meet that I got from Bangladesh and Pakistan, visitors who were in Colombo and wanted to meet to discuss Sri Lanka's macro crisis, what lessons Bangladesh can learn, what lessons Pakistan can learn. I think there is still an appetite for us to learn from each other, because as Shanta very rightly said, this region has been grappling with the same issues of fiscal imbalances and under taxation and the institutional weaknesses for decades, and that's common to all of us. So lessons learned from the region, I think, is far more useful than us trying to learn lessons from Singapore. So there is that. Second, I think from a Sri Lankan perspective, forget the connectivity and the trade and all of the SAARC things that we've been discussing for decades. Bangladesh helped Sri Lanka. They arranged a swap with our central bank for the first time. It became a lender. Reserve Bank of India gave us the largest amount of swaps. One was, of course, under their SAARC fund, but outside of that, they came out as the biggest source of funding through the crisis. So again, I mean, some of it is geopolitics, because China is there, India is there, and they're catching up with each other. But I think the fact that the Bangladesh central bank stepped up to give a swap arrangement, and this was before their own forex crisis started to emerge, that's quite telling. So I think we need to also look beyond the traditional integration issues that we focused on trade linkages, on better physical connectivity, and look at these emerging areas where the region can help each other out. And I think there is considerable scope there to help countries steer their way through the kinds of shocks that we are increasingly seeing, whether it's climate related or financial shocks of that sort. So I have been a little rather skeptical about South Asia, but I still think there is some areas to cooperate, but not traditional new areas.
Thank you. Again, very briefly, Shanta mentioned, and I agree with him, that the diagnosis and the symptoms of the patient are the same for the last 25 years, and the prescription is also the same. So what is it that is different in current IMF program that we can actually walk out from this room considering that it would really bring some change?
Thank you so much. Maybe let me first address your question and then come back to some very insightful points that have been made by the other panelists. I think there are several important goals under this program. One is revenue mobilization. It has to be fairer. It has to be more efficiently. It has to be such that those that have not contributed thus far to the national effort of collecting revenues now also contribute their fair share. Another one is the formal inclusion of the provinces through a national fiscal pact, which will operationalize the 18th constitutional amendment that actually mandates the provinces to raise revenues. So the provinces have to play a prominent role in raising revenues, because there are tax bases that are within their jurisdiction by the Constitution. And in addition to that, the National Fiscal Pact will also enable the devolution of critical social and infrastructure spending to the provinces, while at the same time rethinking and right-sizing the federal government. In terms of the energy sector strategy, there is much more focus and emphasis and specificity in this program toward addressing the cost side reforms that the sector needs, not only to keep the sector viable, but also to ensure more affordable tariffs to all users. And the third aspect is the growth agenda. I can't emphasize this more. This is an agenda that should reduce the economic distortions caused by state intervention in the economy, and which is a critical policy lever to realize, to enhance jobs and welfare and grow the middle class in Pakistan. But let me come back very briefly to a few points I heard. And for that, I want to explain that before we went into this program, the design of this program, we looked at the previous programs and the implementation of the previous programs and the design of the previous programs, because we wanted to draw lessons from past programs. And I would like to do a couple of points. First, what we found is that sustained efforts and ownership is essential for ongoing macroeconomic stability, but also for moving policies from being short-term oriented to being medium-term oriented. And for example, the extended fund facilities in 2013 and in 2019 started with promise, but then momentum for reforms faded. And that led to the deterioration of economic stability and economic conditions more broadly. The things are started to change at the time of the launch of the SBA, and that is a novel development, that there's been a strong ownership since mid-2023, and that strong implementation shows, as I mentioned, that the good policies, the sound policies, can deliver good results and do it relatively quickly. And the second lesson is that, indeed, successive attempts to restore macroeconomic stability and to recalibrate programs to bring them back to the initial goals constrain the space for advancing structural reforms, which is a point that was made by Naji. Thank you for that. I think when it comes to the SDGs, what the program envisions is to continue keeping the borrowing needs of the public sector measured, because that helps freeing up resources for private sector lending, and lending in Pakistan from the domestic banks is very much focused on the public sector, and there should be more resources that go into private sector lending, because the private sector at the end of the day are those that are creating the job opportunities and the investments. On how to get closer to the SDGs, I think the effort that has to be realized in terms of additional fiscal space is very substantial. How is the program envisioning to mobilize revenues through the federal, but also through the provinces? I mentioned it already. And how can the program create a space through priority spending? Well, prioritizing education, healthcare, and at the same time, trying to keep very measured non-priority current spending. And this is what the program is trying to do, to keep the subsidies to the energy sector limited, for which we need to advance on the structural front in the energy sector. I think the point on climate is highly relevant because building climate resilience is very important to mitigate the impact of climate change, which disproportionately affect the poor. So it's also a social policy. And at the moment, the authorities are under the program prioritizing those projects that are aimed at enhancing adaptation. And I think in future, with support from the World Bank, there has to be progress also with a climate finance strategy to mobilize finance for catalyzing external financing in support of the national climate strategy. The authorities have expressed their interest in accessing the IMF's Resilience and Sustainability Facility, which aims to support countries building resilience. And we look forward to expanding our partnership with the development partners and with Pakistan in this space. But let me finalize emphasizing a point I have already made. I think that in order to enhance living standards and welfare, the policy direction that is embedded in the program is to address the state-driven trade pricing distortions and creating an environment where the private sector can thrive and create job opportunities for the people. Thank you.
And finally, Sam, let me start with this macro picture, and then I'd like you to zoom into Pakistan. There's a UN Secretary General on record has been saying repeatedly that the multilateral lenders, they are failing world's poor. He is saying that they are too slow to respond in the time of climate emergency. They are too slow to take care of debt burden, etc. And of course, if I simply translate it in one-liner, perhaps he wants to say that it's part of the policy, due to the policies of multilateral lenders, that the world is not making as much progress as it should have made on SDGs. Now, listening to what we have listened so far, do you think that in Pakistan too, the multilateral lenders, they are failing the excluded and marginalized and the most climate vulnerable segment of society? Or do you see any hope for SDGs going forward?
Thanks. You want me to answer that question sitting next to Esther and Ahmed?
We can swap chairs.
My friends.
I don't see any contradiction between the role that we are deploying and how we are helping Pakistan and the SDGs agenda.
No, like I said, I think for any country, and this doesn't necessarily relate only to Pakistan, there's a space for funding, grant money, financing, loan money, investment money. Esther explained that quite well. You know, where's the space to get more money, fresh money, other people's money crowded in, and then the insurance part. I think there is a global discussion that took place in the Summit of the Future around governance related to the global finance system. I think in the UN system, there is that discussion. UNDP administrator is talking about debt sustainability, etc. And the Secretary General sees that as a bottleneck for everyone to doing well. So it's not about loans are bad. It's about when are they deployed and in what contexts. Like I said, there is a question mark about financing crisis recovery, for example, that will go into areas that do not become assets that have profits in the future. That's a question for the banks and for the funds, as well as for the government that has, to be fair, an insatiable appetite for loans. More and more. I jokingly said in a panel before that I moderated for Esther, when I did a mini research, just a Google research on the first IMF program in 1958, 1959, $25,000. That's what that was. $25,000 is what you get for a Honda Civic these days that anyone is traveling. So I would say maybe the following 2 or 3 very quick things. You asked Abid about what is, as if to complete the sentence, the path towards resilience in Pakistan is what? For me, the path towards resilience in Pakistan is policy continuity in a way that is irreversible, because that's part of the challenge. Somebody comes, ticks the box, and then proceeds to reverse almost all of these commitments, and some kind of coherence as well. And these are very simple questions that I think have a deeper meaning. You ask a question today about who is responsible for climate finance. And if you have to ask that question, then there is an issue. Is it a climate issue or is it a finance issue? Is it Ministry of Climate Change, or is the Ministry of Finance, and everything in between? Is it a provincial thing, or is it a federal issue or a provincial issue if these folks are the first responders? So I would say that's one. Secondly, it is fair, like Shanta was saying, to ask, what is the game changer? Because for the last 20 or 30 years, we know the diagnosis, we know the descriptions, all of this stuff is coming back, including from many senior colleagues who used to be part of the government and now are on the other side in a think tank or retired or coming back as senior advisor. What is the game changer? Not exactly clear. And then the third point, which I think Esther also fairly mentioned, is where do you start? Do you start with 15 million people in Pakistan's 20 poorest districts to make a difference? Maybe. Do you start with 30 million students out of school? Maybe. Do you start with 40% of the population that is poor? Maybe. Do you start with better inclusion of gender and women into the productive workplace? Maybe. So for us, and this comes back again to the point that Esther mentioned fairly in the end, it is a complementarity of issues and people and actors, not necessarily a competition. I think it is not fair for the international community to be addressing the same government partner by sending mixed messages around particular things. I have asked before colleagues who work in the World Bank and resident coordinators in a country in Africa a simple question: do you ever go to your government counterparts and offer different advice on how to get development finance? And they fairly said yes. One is saying go get grants, one is saying maybe explore loans, concessional as they may be. Within the development system, I think we need to be a little bit more coherent also on the issue. And I think that's the challenge, I think, to getting to the SDGs, finding out starting points, actually making a difference. And like I said, none of this is impossible. About 20 countries have actually halved their poverty in a span of 10 to 15 years, a number of which are actually in this region, as was mentioned. But I think it's important to get the comparators right. If everything needs to be compared to China or India or Malaysia or Indonesia, it's not going to go very far. But there may be other comparators that are much more reasonable to try to get ahead with. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Sam. Ladies and gentlemen, I wish I could continue this discussion. And I know that if the session is so interactive and so interesting, we could have gone on and on, but I'm mindful of the commitments of the panelists as well as the participants. I tried to be as much provocative as I could because I knew perhaps I will not be able to take questions from the floor. So I thought I can represent the audience and I can pose their question to the panelists. It was a very rare occasion where we had the representatives of three important partner organizations, as well as Dr. Devarajan, who have vast experience of working in and on South Asia, and Dr. Dushni Virakun, who is heading the think tank IPS, which we call that when we have to introduce in Sri Lanka what is STPI, we usually tell that we are IPS of Pakistan, and vice versa. So it was the consensus that was arriving here that the cost of inaction and cost of denial that can actually take us to the whole decades progress. It can have extremely high cost, but then some glimpse of hopes from all the partners that if we can remain persistent and consistent, the objective that we have in mind, it's not that difficult. Please join me in giving a big round of applause for all of our panelists. And on your way out. If you haven't visited the expo downstairs, please visit it. They are open for your visit, and then they will be closing for the day. We also have a food court where we have indigenous food being served. Please do visit the food courts as well. And from tomorrow, our full-fledged conference would start, where we will have multiple sessions, 4 sessions per slot, followed by an evening plenary. Thank you very much for joining us. Dr. Devarajan, if you can remain on video so that we can have a group picture.
Okay.